Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. The race for the COVID vaccine has entered the next phase, and things appear to be getting very political. Let's introduce our guest for this first part. Alex Berizot is the Vice President of Scientific Affairs for the American Council on Science and Health. Thanks for joining us. And Joanna Hossa, Deputy Director at Wider Europe Programme at the European Council on Foreign Policy. Thank you both for being here. We'll let you loose in a moment. There are several vaccines in circulation right now, only 2 cleared for use in the EU. And there's now a shortage of vaccines across the bloc. And high-level anger to boot. Let's listen to the words of European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen this week.
Europe invested billions to help develop the world's first COVID-19 vaccines, to create a truly global common good. And now the companies must deliver. They must honor their obligations. And this is why we will set up a vaccine export transparency mechanism.
So now there's a 3-way row between the UK, the EU and Astra Zeneca, the supplier who says it can't fulfil a 400 million dose order for Brussels. Let's get the latest on all this from our correspondent Dave Keating, who's watching this one for us. Dave, Astra says it can't deliver on the deal. Why not? What's going on behind all of this?
Well, what's resulted in this incredible back and forth today is essentially AstraZeneca saying that it will not be able to meet the schedule that it had already outlined for distributing the vaccine to the EU in the weeks after approval. We are expecting approval of the AstraZeneca vaccine by the EU Medicines Agency either tomorrow or Friday, but it now looks like EU countries are only going to be getting 1/4 of what they were originally promised under the contract with AstraZeneca. Now, AstraZeneca says this is because the EU signed its contract with the UK 2 months later, and therefore, the EU signed its contract with AstraZeneca 2 months later than the UK, and therefore the production facilities in Europe weren't able to ramp up as quickly. This is the answer for why the distribution to the UK isn't going to be affected, but the distribution to the EU is going to be affected. The EU Commission counters that, look, there were 4 production plants mentioned in this contract, 2 in the EU, 2 in the UK. They're all equal, and so there's no reason why the production facilities in the EU wouldn't have been ramped up before a deal was signed, because those production facilities are also being used to make the vaccine in the UK. And indeed, it looks like in the beginning stages of the rollout in the UK, their vaccines were coming from the EU facilities here. So essentially what the Commission is saying is that AstraZeneca, a UK-based company, is prioritizing the UK here and essentially giving doses that were promised to the EU to the UK. AstraZeneca is saying this is for production reasons, and the Commission wants to know exactly what doses went where over the past weeks, and they're determined, if needed, to force AstraZeneca to move doses that are being produced in the UK over the next weeks to the EU in order to deliver on what it contracted for.
Stella Kyriakides, the EU's Health Commissioner, not accepting this explanation from AstraZeneca that the UK put in its order first and therefore gets served first.
No, she's not. The way she put it today was, we do not agree with this first come, first served approach that might work for the local butcher, but it doesn't work for a contract of this magnitude. And so really, this is about the EU kind of trying to claw back vaccines that it thinks it's owed that actually went to the UK. What we're heading towards here is undoubtedly a vaccine war. This is exactly what the EU wanted to avoid with its joint procurement scheme. And that's why it asked the UK to participate in the joint procurement scheme, because it was worried about this type of conflict developing with the UK. And these are 2 major world powers here. If they can't agree on vaccine access, what hope is there for the rest of the world? So I fear that this is going to get even uglier over the coming days. We'll see how the Commission is meeting with AstraZeneca tonight. We'll see how it goes. But I think this is really being bumped up to a political level here. It's turning into a very Brexit-related conflict in the EU, and it really doesn't bode well for how these vaccines are going to be distributed.
The AstraZeneca vaccine yet to get its green light, but going to happen. You're telling us that. The Pfizer-BioNTech one, problem with that one as well. Where are we up to with the other one, Moderna?
Yeah, people might be wondering because the Moderna vaccine was approved 2 weeks ago. Why aren't we hearing a lot about it? It's because their production capacity in Europe is very, very limited. It was always known that when they approved this drug, the UK really was taking its time to approve Moderna because they just don't have the ability to get a lot of vaccines out here in Europe. That's a vaccine that's looking a lot more to the US for rollout. Certainly, I think right now the EU would like to ramp up the production ability for Moderna, and maybe there's some way to do that because at the very least, this is going to leave a pretty bad taste in the mouth of people in EU governing circles when it comes to the AstraZeneca vaccine. There are plenty of other options. They signed contracts for 6 other vaccines, but right now, there's no more approval requests in the pipeline. If AstraZeneca is approved tomorrow or Friday, that's it. There's no more vaccines that have already made their application. Those applications will come, but it looks like that's not going to be for a while. That's the same case for the UK as well. It's just these 3 that we're working with right now.
Indeed, Dave, thank you very much indeed. And of course, as we're talking about this, and sometimes we smile about these little things that happen, we need to remember that people are dying. And this is an extremely serious situation. And clearly, COVID-19 is something that we're still trying to battle. The French government even today saying that the curfew here isn't working enough, and they're considering perhaps putting the country back into a very strict lockdown. Let's bring in our guests, Alex Berzo and Joanna Hosa, to talk about this one. Over to you, basically. I mean, we have a situation, perhaps, where the vaccine is becoming in some way politicised. Joanna, from your position at the European Council on Foreign Policy, do you see this as something that is really happening, a sort of politicisation of what should be, I suppose, free and fair and distributed to all?
Yes, definitely. So we see the politicization and the geopolitics of it is becoming much more clear. We have the Western vaccines, American and now the British vaccine, and also the Russian vaccine and the Chinese vaccine as the main players. And these are also very important geopolitical players in the world now. So this race for the vaccine is inevitably becoming a geopolitical race, as also European neighbors are taking difficult decisions where to get the vaccines from, even if they would like to procure the Western vaccines. This is not always possible as the queue is long. So they are turning to China. They are considering the Russian option, even if they're seen as less effective, and it's a complicated picture there.
A very complicated picture, as you say, but at the basis of it, there's almost a kind of a monetary exchange or a sort of a commercial exchange between the EU and AstraZeneca, which is causing this great kind of loggerheads row at the moment between the two, and of course the UK involved as a third party, which makes things even more complicated. Let's bring in Alex Berzo for maybe a thought on that, and a thought how things are in the United States, of course. You're at the American Council on Science and Health. Is the vaccine being geopolitically manipulated? I'll throw that out there. You tell me how you feel about that phrase. Is that happening in the US?
Well, I definitely think that it's happening around the whole world. The other guest is completely correct that you've got Russia and China who are waiting in the sidelines watching as Europe fights amongst themselves to get the vaccine. Unfortunately, this is one of the problems that was very predictable. And it wasn't really a problem that we could have done anything about in advance. Vaccines take time to make. Pfizer is working as hard as it can. AstraZeneca is working as hard as it can. And we knew there simply would not be enough supply to meet demand. We knew this ahead of time, and now it's playing out in a very nasty way. In the United States, we're not seeing this play out quite as much because the fight is more internal. Which states are going to get the vaccine first? But we're not seeing the level of nastiness in the United States as is going on in Europe right now.
In terms of what the US is doing, what's it doing right, in your opinion?
Well, we are vaccinating a lot quicker than we had been. About 7% of our population is now vaccinated, if I understand correctly, compared to about 2% in Europe. So we have started loosening the restrictions. We had some very tight restrictions on who could get vaccinated. We had people who had underlying conditions or were a certain age. And we started relaxing those conditions so that we get the vaccines into more arms. So I think that policy is correct. I am skeptical, however, of our policy of giving out everyone to get a first dose before we have second doses secured, because we don't know whether or not the vaccine is effective if you only get one dose. That's a gamble that we're taking that I think could backfire.
Indeed, that idea of extending that gap is something that is raising lots of questions around the world, of course. And the death toll is over 2 million, over 100,000 in the UK, something like 75,000 here in France. Joanna, to bring you back in to talk about this one, and certainly the European perspective on this. I mean, clearly there is an urgency about getting this sorted out for the entire bloc of 27.
There is an urgency for sure. However, there is just not enough vaccine. So while the vaccine doses become scant, the conflict will continue and it might get worse, as we've heard before. So the fight between the UK and the EU might deteriorate, but also internal infighting in the EU is a risk. The European Commission tried to centralize the system. It has worked to a great extent so far. The European Commission has bought many more doses than the bloc needs. About 2 billion doses have been purchased, which is way more than the EU needs. Of course, all these vaccines are not yet available, not yet even developed. So while that is the case, the EU has a problem and cannot also share the vaccines abroad as it was hoping to do quite soon. So there is risk that European countries will even look for bilateral deals with other producers. We have seen that Chancellor Merkel has been talking to President Putin of Russia about potentially working together on Sputnik. We don't know the details of that, and remains to be seen how that plays out. But there has been rumors about maybe Germany going its own way and producing vaccines with Russia, despite all the other political problems that there are between the EU and Russia. So there is certain willingness to avoid other sensitive topics and focus on the pandemic, on the vaccine. So if the Central European Commission scheme doesn't work, we might see more side deals from European countries.
Indeed, and of course that calls into question the whole concept of having a 27 block sort of encompassing medical body that approves these vaccines in that kind of way. You mentioned, of course, Russia with Sputnik V. I'm thinking of a country like Ukraine, which finds itself obviously between the EU, between Russia, obviously, and I suppose ripe to be manipulated in some way about which kind of vaccine it takes.
So Ukraine is in a very difficult position. Ideally, it would like to have the Western vaccines, but they are not yet available. The Ukrainian government has made a lot of effort to purchase them already, but that hasn't materialized yet. Ukraine has been offered the Russian vaccine, but has flatly refused because it's not a partner that Ukraine would like to work with. The countries are at war, but also because the vaccine is less reliable, less trusted. It had hiccups at the start, and that affected its reliability, even if the indicators are better now. And so we see Ukraine purchasing Chinese vaccines, and that's not surprising. It's looking for options that are available. But so far, I believe only 1.9 million vaccines, Chinese vaccines, have been purchased by Ukraine. So there is certainly room for more. It's a country of 45 million people. So I think that as soon as possible, Ukraine will be happy to purchase more Western vaccines, probably not the Russian one.
Indeed, it's one of these things. You're thinking that every decision involves waiting for a vaccine to be improved, and obviously at the time you're waiting, it's a terribly sad fact, people are losing their lives to this virus, which is awful. Joanna, thank you very much indeed. Do stay with us. Let's bring Alex back in to give us some kind of insight into this idea that we heard there from Joanna about different countries getting into supplying other places. For instance, Joanna was talking, Alex, about China now supplying some doses of vaccine to Ukraine. We know China supplies certain poorer countries in its vicinity with the vaccine. I'm thinking, is this a kind of a soft power that they're using to kind of spread their influence, or is there something else behind that, do you think?
It's absolutely a tool of diplomacy. In fact, people are talking about vaccine diplomacy coming from China. India is actually pushing back against China. They're doing their own vaccine diplomacy, and a nationalist website in India was uh, poking at China, saying that some countries spread viruses and some spread cures, and of course they were talking about India. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of geopolitical posturing, trying to get advantages geopolitically for the future. Yeah, absolutely, that's going to be occurring. One problem that we probably didn't foresee coming was the degree to which countries are going to be nationalistic, right? So AstraZeneca is a British firm, Pfizer's an American firm, and there are going to be people who are wondering why it is that a British firm is vaccinating other people outside of Britain first, or why would Pfizer be vaccinating people outside of the United States first? And so I think that we're seeing a little bit of nationalism play in here that is exacerbating the problem.
Indeed. And on that same point, going back to the British thing, clearly it's emerging in the British press that they're citing this, and there's kind of the right-leaning British press that were the ones that were campaigning for Brexit, for instance. They're saying, look, this shows that Brexit's a great thing because we were able to be quick and nimble and snaffle these vaccines and get people vaccinated against COVID-19. It's a good thing. People using the situation for their own political ends.
Well, absolutely, and I think that it's not quite fair enough to blame the EU for all of for the lack of vaccination, because the EU is a much bigger bloc than the United Kingdom. United Kingdom is what, 60, 70 million people,
Yeah.
and the European Union is 500 million. So of course there's going to be fewer people as a percentage vaccinated in the European Union because there's just not that many vaccines. People are going to be using this to justify whatever political position that they want. I don't think it's legitimate to point to this and say, see, Brexit was justified.
Indeed. And Joanna, final word for you from this first part of our debate. While people are playing politics, geopolitics with this, people are at risk. Shouldn't there be some greater good that comes into play here to ensure that things go around and things get around?
Of course, there should be. And this is also understood by many governments, by the World Health Organization that has this global COVAX program for vaccine. But people repeat this message and they say, yes, the virus knows no borders. This is a global crisis like no other. But in the end, national governments risk their internal pressures and they are doing everything to satisfy their voters first. And what we see in Britain is, you mentioned the right-wing press or the pro-Brexit press, they are very, very keen to instrumentalize any kind of situation like this to argue again and again how Brexit was a great idea. No matter, they will disregard the implications of the virus being ever present on the continent if they can make a case that their island is safe. So,
Joanna Hosa, thank you very much indeed. Joanna Hosa, Deputy Director of the Wider Europe Programme at the European Council on Foreign Policy. And Alex Berezo, thank you too, sir, Vice President of Scientific Affairs for the American Council on Science and Health. That's part one of our debate. Stay with us, more to come. Welcome back. Part two of the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. We're discussing the COVID vaccine. We spent part one talking mostly about the EU-UK row over AstraZeneca jabs. Now we intend to expand our discussion to bring in the rest of the world. Our guests joining us by Skype from Paris, Nathalie Ernaud, who's an advocacy director of the Access to Essential Medicines campaign at Doctors Without Borders. Thank you for joining us. Also researcher at Iris, co-director of the Observatory for Global Health. Thank you again for being with us here in France 24. We appreciate your time. And by Skype from Berlin, Theodore Murphy, who's director of the Africa Programme at the European Council on Foreign Policy. You'll be with us let loose to give us your opinions in a moment. Is the COVID vaccine then now a geopolitical issue? Let's take a look at this report from Yenna Lee.
It's a global public good that's neither global nor public. Despite the UN's efforts to brand COVID vaccines as a necessity for the planet, access to the rare products is highlighting inequality.
If developed countries think they will be safe if they vaccinate their own people while neglecting the developing world, they are wrong.
Early on in the pandemic, most wealthy nations invested massively in their own pharmaceutical companies, putting them in prime position to reserve vaccines. For example, leading companies such as Pfizer, Moderna and Astra Zeneca have signed deals with the EU, the US and the UK. Other high-income states such as Japan and South Korea have placed orders with these firms, though they have yet to receive their shipments. The country with the most successful vaccination drive so far is Israel. Last year, it struck a deal with Pfizer, early and steady deliveries in exchange for data. 70% of inoculations have so far taken place in rich countries. States with less options are turning towards Russia, China and India, scientific powerhouses that are actively promoting their vaccine and using their know-how as a soft power tool. Russia's Sputnik V has been embraced by Hungary, Argentina, Venezuela, Iran and others. Chinese pharma companies have signed deals with 24 countries, including Turkey, where President Recep Tayyip Erdogan received his dose on television. From Egypt to Indonesia, Beijing's Health Silk Road is plugging the holes left by the West's monopoly of Western vaccines. To counter China's presence in Asia, India has once again come forward as a regional player. The international leader in generic drugs has started to ship free COVID jabs to Bangladesh and Nepal. In a bid to avoid vaccine nationalism, the WHO set up COVAX. Most countries have signed up to the scheme that pledges to fairly distribute COVID drugs. An ambitious project that's weakened by the number of bilateral deals across the globe.
There is a pattern that's developed that the rich are getting more access to these things than the poor. That happens in a Western country or a so-called rich country. And then, of course, when you take that onto a world scale, it becomes even more exacerbated. Let's bring in Nathalie Ernaud from Doctors Without Borders and from IRIS to comment on that one, first of all. Nathalie, this aspect of the vaccine becoming a geopolitical tool in many ways is something we've explored a bit in part one. In your opinion, how are things developing along those lines? Is the vaccine getting to where it should get to? Do you think the right markers are put down to make this happen?
Yeah, I think you're as you're showing, it is indeed, becoming a burning issue. I think, in the first wave, some countries were not that affected, but today we see in different, geographies, more and more countries being affected, in particular on the African continent. And we could, just speak about South African region, and the countries are not in a position actually to get access really to some of these vaccines. So I think we, and at the same time, the COVAX, as you were mentioning, who was supposed to be the mechanism to, to deliver at least to cover 20% of the most vulnerable, has not been able so far to deliver any vaccine at all. So countries are, having, empty-handed, so they have to find, different solution, and therefore they are looking at, other suppliers, newcomers, I would say, like, the Chinese vaccine, the Russians vaccine, to try to secure, some doses for their own population. So there is, a big political pressure, these days on vaccine. We see it also in Europe, and all the countries are trying to find solutions.
Nathalie, can I just stay with you for another question, if that's okay? This aspect of different vaccines from different countries now sort of propping up and being used. And clearly the EU might look at that and think, well, these vaccines aren't cleared at the level that we would like them to be cleared at. I wonder how you feel about that, those kind of vaccines being sort of sent to poorer countries. Is the thing to have any vaccine rather than no vaccine? Is that the important thing?
I don't think so. I think some of these vaccines actually two of the Chinese vaccines are these days in the process of being filed at WHO for some pre-qualification. So I think there is a regulatory process that is happening. I know it is also happening for the Russian, but it's going to probably come later. But it is very possible that two of the Chinese vaccine will have an emergency approval from WHO in the coming weeks. So yes, this is important just to have a sense of the efficacy of the vaccine. It was the same for the Pfizer and Moderna. I don't know if you remember, but when they through press release informed about their efficacy, everyone was asking for concrete data to have a good sense of of the efficacy and the quality of the vaccine. That's a kind of a normal process to go through.
Indeed, it's what everybody wants to know. Is it going to work? And that's without sort of spacing, increasing the distance between the first injection and the second injection, creating more complications. Natalie Erno, please stay with us. Thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Theodore Murphy from the European Council on Foreign Relations, Director there of the Africa Programme. Theodore, thanks for being with us and thanks for waiting patiently and listening to what Natalie was saying. Africa, in your opinion, is Africa being shortchanged right now in this vaccine program worldwide? Is Africa not getting the service that it requires?
Absolutely. Look, we're in, if we pan out and look at this globally, we're in a situation of limited supply. And the wealthier parts of the world, the ones who had more money, typically in the West, were able to pre-order their vaccines far ahead. Now, because the supply of the vaccine is so limited, because we can't replicate Pfizer's and BioNTech's at the drop of a hat, there's no way to expand the availability of doses, globally speaking. So what has happened is that Africa has had to not been able to enter into these bilateral pre-purchasing agreements, hasn't been able to reserve their doses early on because they don't have the financial means. They don't have the money, basically, to get into these deals. As such, they're left with the multilateral option. And that is what some of your speakers have referred to as the COVAX platform, which is a great idea, but it relies on the same limited Western production. And so the West is saying, on the one hand to Africa, look, don't worry, it's going to be fine. There's a COVAX, there's this multilateral option where you'll be able to get your supplies from. But on the other hand, the West is basically taking with the one hand from what is supposed to be allotted to COVAX from the other. So Africa has found itself in a position where it knows that the multilateral COVAX option is going to give it something, but definitely not enough. And now has been looking about how can it replicate the West strategy, which is to say, how can it also bilaterally purchase the vaccine? And that's what brings us then to Russia, but more to China. They have an excess of production. They may have handled the outbreak better in their own country. Therefore, the vaccines that they're producing, different from BioNTech and Pfizer, may be more available to be used externally. And in this situation of scarcity, the vaccine is definitely becoming a geopolitical currency. You can sell it, but you can also trade it for favors. You can advance your position vis-a-vis the recipients of the vaccine. So China vis-a-vis Africa, very well. It's an incredibly effective tool.
Theodore, we'll come back to you in a moment. We're going to hear now from the South African President, Cyril Ramaphosa, speaking, a few days ago, about the situation.
The rich countries of the world went out and acquired large doses of vaccines. And some countries have even gone beyond and acquired up to 4 times what their population needs. And that was aimed at hoarding these vaccines. And now this is being done to the exclusion of other countries in the world that most need this.
Vaccine hoarding, the problem there identified by Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa. There is, of course, a South African variant of COVID-19 said to be as contagious and possibly as dangerous as both the British one and the Brazilian one, which are doing the rounds, of course. The British one said to take over, according to the experts, from the actual original COVID-19 variant as time goes by. Of course, the race now becomes one to get people vaccinated and achieve something called herd immunity before that happens. We have two guests here to discuss the situation, Natalie Erno from Doctors Without Borders and the IRIS Research Centre, and Theodore Murphy, who we were just hearing from, Director of the Africa Programme of the European Council on Foreign Policy. Theodore, I'll bring you back in to sort of reflect on what Cyril Ramaphosa was saying there. I mean, clearly there's a sense from the South African president that his country and the other African states really, I suppose, at the mercy of the rich world.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a dramatic situation when you're looking at this from the African perspective. To bring on, the European side of the argument, there is an obligation you have as a European government to your constituency, to your people. You have to also be able to provide for them. But has there been a bit of over-acquisitiveness on the part of European and Western governments? I think undoubtedly so. You've mentioned before that some countries have ordered up to 4 times the amount of their population. There is a caveat there, though. At the beginning, no one knew which of these vaccines was going to hit, so which one was going to be effective. That meant that it was very expensive, but you had to bet on different producers in parallel, and you had to put money down up front. Now, where most of them are turning out to be viable, it does look like you are incredibly oversubscribed as a Western country. And there's a big question about what to do with the excess that the West will have. One option, of course, would be to donate it. So to give your excess towards this multilateral COVAX platform, which could then distribute it further onwards to low-income parts of the world, ones that couldn't buy it bilaterally. So Africa could come up there. But there's other ideas at play as well. We talked, the core problem is supply. You can't just simply manufacture more. Even if you have more money now, you can't speed up and increase the amount of production. So supply is inevitably limited. One of the ideas that's being proposed from Africa, which is very interesting, is Africa has its own production capacity, but it doesn't have the know-how. That is something that is held very closely. And Africa is asking for there to be an exemption on the intellectual property linked to the vaccine, which would then be transferred to them and allow them to produce for themselves. A very interesting solution, but this has been held up until now.
Indeed, Theodore, thank you for that. I'll take that idea to Natalie for a comment on that. Natalie, the EU pre-purchasing something like 3 million shots of various vaccines from 6 different suppliers. And of course, then questions are asked when things run out and orders can't be delivered. And we've explored that these things happen, and clearly there's a demand and there's a time limit to create a vaccine. It takes time. You can't just do it overnight like that. Would it not be sensible, just building on this idea about helping Africa, to rather than sort of send surplus supply there, but actually sort of get involved in that exchange of technology, maybe build the centres there? Sanofi, for instance, is going to build a factory in Germany to help produce vaccines there. With Pfizer, why not do it in Africa?
I think that's a good point. I think there are 2 things I would say. Donation, building a site to manufacture a vaccine is not happening overnight, right? So actually, with the excess today, there is definitely a need for countries, high-income countries, to give, some of these doses so that the countries that are in most need now, and we were talking about South Africa, which is a good example, can get access also to these vaccines so that they can vaccinate, their priority group, which are basically health workers, and fragile people or people with comorbidities. I think, the one of the key problems is that none of the high-income countries are willing to follow WHO equitable allocation framework, which was recommending to vaccinate 20% of the population, which was the target. So if high-income countries were doing so, there would be, some vaccines available. So at least now, at the moment, because, some countries, they need the vaccines now. They don't need it in 6 months. They need them now. So that's the first thing. But on the longer term or midterm, indeed, a number of countries, in particular middle-income countries, do have production capacity, and there is a need to build and support this production capacity. And this can happen if there is a true collaboration, to share, know-how and make sure that you can transfer this capacity in different places so that you can increase production capacity. And to be honest, for the next pandemic, we don't expect this to happen tomorrow, but we need to have, a good network of production and capacity, around the world in different geographies. And many countries do have this capacity. It's also a matter of sharing know-how, investing, also public money to see that happen. So yeah, I do believe that this is definitely a good idea. And India, African countries have been pushing at WTO a waiver on intellectual property, also facilitating know-how sharing. I think these they came also with this proposition because from day one of the pandemic, all the discourse from, governments, pharmaceutical companies to say, yes, we're going to share knowledge. Yes, we're going to have it as a public good. Nothing has happened. There has been zero voluntary measure to be in a position to really try to support, production capacity. And the situation in which we are today is not new. We knew that from day one. We knew it was a pandemic. We knew we were in need of, large production capacity, but nothing has happened. So now I think it's really time to see, very concrete commitments from pharmaceutical companies also to cooperate with different, partners in different places, share know-how, make sure that there is a way to, gear up, and ramp up production.
Indeed, fundamentally, I think the problem is it's a business, isn't it? That's it. Just a little bit of news for you. South Africa's health minister says the first flight carrying the first million vaccine doses will arrive on February the 1st. Just to put that in perspective, the South African population is something like, I think, let me check, nearly 60 million people. So that's 1 million doses arriving. Theodore, this might be the final comment on this debate, but can I give it to you, sir? India has the SSI production centre for vaccines. Is that something that could be replicated, should be replicated on African soil somewhere?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's what I was hinting at before. I think it might be difficult when we see the shortage of vaccines, even within Europe, to justify taking from that extremely limited supply and diverting to Africa. But helping African manufacture, you don't need to build the factories. They even exist. What you need to do is take the secret formula, which is the golden goose. We understand why pharmaceuticals are holding it very tightly. But you could share it in this one exceptional case, in this pandemic situation that we're in, and try to start building up Africa's capacity to manufacture for itself. It would be in keeping with our European values, calling this a global good. But I also think there's an interest-based argument for it. If we don't do it, the Chinese will. And Africa is, for Europe, a key opportunity that we shouldn't lose.
Theodore Murphy, Director of the Africa Programme at the European Council on Foreign Policy. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to Nathalie Ernaud, who is the Advocacy Director of the Access to Essential Medicines campaign at Doctors Without Borders and researcher at IRIS, co-director of the Observatory of Global Health. Thank you both for joining us. Thanks to both our guests in part one, and thanks to you for watching. Stay with us, more to come. You're watching France 24.